Ariston walked through the corridors of the port of Corinth, the children of commerce and the voices of the merchants echoing around him. He was familiar with that environment. For him, the pulse of commercial transactions, the sound of coins exchanging hands, and the smell of spices were the real blood that ran through the veins of Corinth. The sun reflected off the nearby sea, illuminating the vast galleys that brought goods from all corners of the Mediterranean. His presence was respected and noticed by everyone. With his finely adorned clothes and confident bearing, Ariston was an example of success. Born into a humble family, he built an empire in the wine and olive oil trade, becoming one of the most influential merchants in the city. His name was associated with the forests and the ability to negotiate like few others. As he walked to his house, an imposing building overlooking the port, he reflected on his recent achievements. The trade routes that had been planned and the partnerships he had signed had only strengthened his position. He felt unshakable. After all, the control he had over his business gave him the security that his future was guaranteed. However, there were rumors of war. The cities to the north were in conflict, and trade between them and Corinth began to be affected. Ariston ignored these murmurs, believing that his experience would make him capable of dealing with any setback. When he arrived at his house, however, a message was waiting for him. The messenger's expression was grave. As he read the parchment, Ariston felt the weight of the words. Trade on one of the main routes that supported his business had been interrupted. It was the beginning of a crisis he could never have foreseen. The tension in the port of Corinth grew by the day. The collapse of the trade route between the northern cities and the Mediterranean was only the beginning. Ariston watched helplessly as the flow of goods, which had previously flowed into the city like an incessant river, came to a halt. The war, which he had underestimated, was now directly affecting his operations. His fortune began to slip away quickly. Each week, new reports arrived with even more disheartening news. Suppliers who couldn't honor contracts, galleys that didn't return, and stocks that were dwindling. Ariston convened daily meetings with his associates, looking for quick and strategic solutions, but all the alternatives were problems in the face of the magnitude of the problem. One day, while walking through the empty courtyard of his warehouse, Ariston found himself thinking about what it wanted for him. He always prided himself on his ability to control his destiny. Every coin, every ship he put to sea was an extension of his own will. But now, the scenario seemed completely beyond his control. A sense of powerlessness began to erode his confidence. "We need an immediate solution," he said at one of the meetings with his advisors. "This situation is temporary. Let's keep calm." But internally, Ariston felt the weight of uncertainty growing. His partners interacted discreetly. Rumors that his influence was waning spread quickly through the city. Doors that used to open easily now closed in front of him. A few days later, a final letter arrived, bringing the final blow. The war had intensified, making the destruction of his trade routes irreversible. Ariston, for the first time, felt truly alone, facing the imminent ruin of everything he had built. With no clear alternatives, and without the resources that had previously sustained him, Ariston wandered the streets of Corinth in search of meaning. It was as if the city, once full of life and movement, had become oppressive and indifferent to his presence. His former colleagues avoided his company, fearing that his destruction might contaminate them. On one of the darkest days, while crossing the almost empty market, Ariston noticed a small group gathered near the central square. Curious, he moved along, listening to the words of an older man who spoke with impressive calm. His name was Cleanthes of Assos, a widely respected Stoic philosopher. Unlike the merchants, he spoke not of riches, but of the mind and soul. His words echoed principles of ease and detachment. "It's not the events that disturb men, but how we interpret them," Cleanthes told his small group of listeners. He spoke about controlling emotions, about how true peace did not come from the outside world, but from within ourselves. Ariston, his mind full of worries from the first moment. What did these men understand about commerce or the weight of responsibility? How could these words bring consolation when their lives were on the brink of collapse? Even so, something about that serenity caught his attention. He left the square, but Cleanthes' words continued to echo in his mind. planting a seed of reflection that he still didn't fully understand. The following weeks brought confirmation of what Ariston had feared most. Bankruptcy was complicated. All his efforts to save what was left of his business empire proved fruitless. He sold what he could, from his remaining stocks to part of his property, but nothing seemed enough to avoid total ruin. His gold reserves were rapidly running out, and the trust of his few remaining partners was evaporating. Ariston observed that while his ships, which had once dominated the Mediterranean waters, were being sold at prices far below what they were worth, each transaction eroded his pride. He, who had once had a firm grip on his fortune, now saw it slip through his fingers like sand. The humiliation was complete when he had to get rid of his house, the imposing building that dominated the view of the port, where he had so often contemplated the success of his business. Desperate and aimless, Ariston isolated himself. He could no longer bear to look at the familiar faces on the streets of Corinth, who once revered him and now only murmured with pity or contempt. The doors that had once opened for him now closed unceremoniously. The weight of loneliness began to suffocate him. One particularly gloomy evening, sitting in the ruins of his old house, he remembered the words of Cleanthes. "It is not events that disturb men." The phrase echoed in his mind like a distant but constant voice. For the first time, Ariston considered that perhaps his pain came not just from the loss of his possessions, but from his attachment to them. The next morning, with no alternatives and no hope, he decided to seek out the philosopher. Ariston walked to the small residence of Cleanthes, located on the outskirts of Corinth. It wasn't the home of a wealthy man, but there was a serenity about it that intrigued Ariston. The philosopher welcomed him with a calm smile, as if he already knew the reason for his visit. Without hesitation, he invited him to sit next to him on a stone bench, facing the hills. "I've lost everything," Ariston began, his voice heavy. "My wealth, my status, my home, everything is gone. What's left for me now?" Cleanthes looked at him for a moment, then replied with the same serenity. "And what did you really lose, Ariston? What were these things really under your control?" Ariston remained silent, reflecting. "My possessions, my position, I controlled all that." The philosopher shook his head. "You had the illusion of control. War, trade routes, the trust of others, all of this is out of our hands. You built your life around things that were never under your control. What you could have controlled was the way you reacted to those losses." Ariston, confused, replied, "But how can I live without these things? My life has been defined by them." Wipe lightly. True freedom, my friend, lies in not being a slave to external desires or things. When you accept what you cannot change and control only your own actions and emotions, you find peace. That is Stoicism. It's not events, but our responses to them that disturb us. Ariston, still skeptical, felt something changing inside him. Cleanthes' words began to make sense, but he wasn't yet ready to fully embrace them. A few days later, Ariston was approached by an old business partner. He had a tempting proposal, a new business venture in the north, far from the areas affected by the war. The opportunity seemed perfect for Ariston to recover his fortune, and the man encouraged him to accept quickly, before other investors got involved. Ariston, anxious to reverse his situation, almost accepted the proposal without hesitation. The idea of rebuilding his old life, of recovering his lost prestige, was extremely appropriate. However, as he pondered it, Cleanthes' words popped into his mind again. "You're clinging to something you've never controlled." He walked to the harbor to reflect. The sea was calm, but the memories of his losses haunted him. If he entered this cycle again, he would be doomed to suffer the same anguish as before. The incessant pursuit of wealth would always leave him vulnerable to chance and fortune, like a boat adrift on the unpredictable waves of life. Suddenly, he realized that the temptation was not in the gold he might win, but in the illusion of security that this gold promised. Ariston hesitated, knowing that the choice he would make would shape the rest of his life. Ariston decided to turn down the offer. He didn't do it out of fear or insecurity, but out of a new understanding. For the first time, he accepted that his obsession with control and the accumulation of wealth was the source of his anguish. Upon returning to Cleanthes' house, Ariston decided to make up his own mind. The philosopher listened to him in silence, then nodded with a slight smile. "You're learning, Ariston. True freedom doesn't lie in having more, but in needing less. You've already realized that peace of mind is only possible when we accept what is beyond our control. The decision brought Ariston an unexpected sense of collapse. Although he was still far from a comfortable life, he felt that something deeper had been achieved. He was no longer a slave to his fortune, nor to his confidence. Ariston's life changed significantly. Without the pressure of maintaining his former wealth and status, he opted for a simpler existence. He now helped small merchants in Corinth by sharing his experience and, curiously, was pleased with their success, even if their profits were modest. He took part in community activities and devoted himself to philosophical studies with Cleanthes. The accessibility of what he couldn't control and the focus on what was under his control brought a serenity previously unknown. Ariston understood that true wealth lay in his ability to deal with adversity calmly and not in his bank account or social position. Over time, he returned to trading, but now without the obsession with profit at any cost. He operated prudently, sticking to the principles he had learned. Sitting on a hill overlooking the port of Corinth, Ariston contemplated his journey. The horizon stretched out before him, the calm waters reminding him of the flow of life. Sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent. But like the sea, he now knew that he couldn't control the tides, only how he navigated them. What have I really lost? He thought. It wasn't his wealth, but his attachment to it that had caused him so much suffering. Cleanthes was right. What mattered most was not what happened outside, but how he reacted internally. The realization that fate is unpredictable, but that he could control his own mind, brought him a peace he had never imagined possible. As the sun set, Ariston conceded, grateful for the lessons that adversity had brought him. He finally understood that true freedom lay not in external riches, but in the serenity of the soul. The crisis had stripped him of his possessions, but in return it had given him something infinitely more valuable: freedom over himself.